debate since any of them. They started in 1976 and have, repeated themselves several times up until now 2020. Well, why would some say that this is an important vice presidential debate? Well, one of the reasons is that the current administration, the Trump administration, and vice presidential candidate Mike Pence, if you look at the polls, are not doing too hot. A recent tweet from Nate Cohen of the New York Times would suggest that Mike Pence, or sorry, not Mike Pence, but that the Biden campaign is currently up 9.5 percentage points on national polls. Now, while that does not translate directly into the Electoral College, where you need to win 270 total votes within the Electoral College to become elected, if you have spent much time, like many of us have, in paying attention to both polling and various data to suggest the state of the race, the Trump administration is not doing too hot. Okay. And so what that suggests is, especially considering the last debate that occurred had limited, if not a negative impact on the Trump administration's polling, that the vice presidential debate is an essential debate, especially for the Trump administration, to find a way to gain traction with many of the swing voters in essential states such as Florida, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Iowa, Wisconsin, Arizona, and Nevada. Okay. So, just making sure that our video is currently working. Apologies for the delay. Okay. So with that, Pence, and the last debate was, considered to be a bit of a catastrophe. And I think for a lot of the pundits that are out there, but as well as the American voters that are out there as well. The idea of a debate is you're going to have two sides that will come in and at least agree on some semblance of decorum and rules in order to hash out a dialogue, a debate, a verbal spat of sorts, so that the audience can then understand and recognize their choices a little bit better and maybe make a more informed choice in the end. Well, if you break or shatter those rules, then the role of debate becomes null and void. And so with 128 to 135, depending on who you ask, counted interruptions that occurred during the last presidential debate, it left, I'd say, 95% of us fairly frustrated with the state of the race as well as the state of political debates. Well, the hope is for the Trump administration that they can change their tone a little bit and their tune with this debate, start anew. There tends to be an issue with media coverage of debates where they view things as if there is a narrative continuity that starts with a beginning, a middle, and an end, going all the way through from the horse race of the election system or the election season. Okay, and so if all of a sudden Pence comes in and does really well in this debate and maybe is considered to have won the debate, that may help take over the narrative going into tomorrow and the next few days on, Pence and the Trump administration are really starting to turn it around. Well, that then requires, if future debates are going to happen, considering Trump has come down with COVID-19 and given the reports that we have from the doctors doing better, but if Trump comes into the next debate and then tones it down a little bit, less interruptions, at least in the context of Trump, and gets a few quality arguments in, maybe about the course of their economy for the 3 years previous to the COVID-19 crisis or situation, and gets a few jabs back at Biden and lets Biden shine a little bit. Does that then have those two performances help combine into a new narrative where things are going, relatively well or better for the Trump administration? you can imagine that as being potentially helpful. If you have low expectations for a debater and they outperform, they tend to get a few more, win points of sorts. America loves an underdog, but that type of narrative is odd. It's weird for an administration, okay, an incumbent to come in as the underdog that needs to, overcome low expectations of, their audience. So whether or not that narrative gains traction is something entirely different. But and the next thing is that if a part of the goal of this debate and reasons why it's a critical or important debate for the Trump administration is to change the narrative, can this administration possibly do that? Okay. If you poll or look at polls of voters and what they think is the most salient issues, the COVID-19 crisis is towards the top. The economy is also circulated around there. Foreign policy tends to tail off pretty far down the line. Healthcare clearly is another topic in the context of COVID-19. What's happening with the Supreme Court, also a major issue, depending on which category of people that you reference, whether women, male, racial dynamics, Black Lives Matter, the context of police violence and things like that. It really depends on who you talk to and what they decide to be one of the most important issues. But the deal is that there's a lot of noise that's being kicked up from all of these particular issues that is occurring, let alone Trump's kind of need to be the talk of the town. So an hour, or I think 2 hours before the start of this debate, Trump released another video on Twitter in which he is referencing his rebounding health, as well as the drug cocktails that he took, that he promises the American people that he will, make it free if people land in the hospital with COVID-19. Whether or not those promises can be kept is besides the point. But that's 2 hours before the start of the debate. And while I currently don't have CNN or Fox News or the various other news stations up right now, I can basically guarantee that it does distract a little bit from the debate. And so Trump, as a factor of conversation or discussion, is taking the oxygen out of the room even before Pence has an opportunity to debate, which means that even if his vice president does well, is it really going to carry forward into the next few days, that it maintains, at least some some top spots within, the media cycle. And I have extreme, question marks on whether or not, that would actually occur, right? So here's the other reason why this debate, and more in an academic sense, and also maybe from the American public sense, why this debate absolutely matters. We have two leading presidential candidates. Trump is 74. And Biden is currently 77, will be the oldest elected president to go into the White House on record. We know that, COVID can have devastating implications for the elderly population, especially populations that have comorbidities. And so how much, we believe the information that's coming out from the White House, how Trump is actually doing with this disease. Is he fully recovered or not? Does he still have it in his system? Are there risks relative to blood clots and things like that many people have suffered and dealt with in contracting, that disease? Well, regardless of that, I mean, the health question is still there, just body-wise, for both of the candidates, let alone that Biden has yet to contract it. Can or could he contract it after election, or after, being placed into the White House if he wins? And so here we have two vice presidents that could potentially take over the role of the White House. And considering the age, the risks of disease that are out there, does the American public take into account a higher account than typical about the second in command, or the second person who could take over the White House if something, and God forbid, occurs to either candidate while they're in the White House? And so what you have is Kamala Harris. One of the things that, if you paid attention, if you were a part of the Democratic primary debate system, you got to learn a lot about Kamala Harris throughout that primary election season. She had some very solid performances in the debate. And interestingly enough, one of the heaviest hits or attacks that she had in the debate was actually against her current, running mate, which produced both, some jokes, but a little bit of awkwardness when Joe Biden decided to select Kamala Harris as, his running mate. But she's somebody that, as an attorney general of California, it's pretty clear that she is prepared to, attack and defend the perspective that she truly, believes in, which anybody can kind of fall under that category. But she can go on offense, and she can do it, quite well, if that is a part of the strategy or tactic that she is bringing in to this debate. But is that one of the goals that the Biden administration wants for this particular debate? So there's been some discussion. We have a White House that is currently being, impacted by a significant spreading event around the Supreme Court nomination. I haven't heard anything about Chris Christie and how he is doing since he checked into the hospital. Still some bad things can absolutely happen from this virus that is navigating through the White House. Okay. Does this then place Kamala Harris into a environment or situation that they need to scale down some of those attacks in order to come off as the kind of happier or better in terms of being good people candidate in the eyes of the American people? Well, some could say that if that's the type of standard that you would place on Kamala Harris and the Biden campaign, that the Trump administration can then take advantage and continue their attacks, which there's clear evidence that on Facebook and the various media buys, television ads, you name it, that the attack is still on from the Trump administration. Okay. But while you're debating, if I were coaching Kamala Harris, one of the things that I would suggest is when beginning the debate is to recognize the elephant in the room, that there are still administrations, members of the administration that are sick, and that you wish them well, and you would never want them to, have harm done to them. That shows two things. One, it's within the vein of the campaign identity, the value system that I think Biden is promoting. The idea of being able to empathize. Empathy is a key term that the Biden campaign has been using in several of their, campaign spots. And so if empathy is going to drive the vote, and that's what the American people want, or at least enough to decide and determine the Electoral College victory in the swing states, that, given if it's a part of their strategy, is going to be one of the first things that happens in the beginning. But if you are a Democratic supporter and you're tuning into this debate to see whether or not Kamala Harris reflects your values, your interest, and you watched her in these, these primary debates engage in some heated discussions against more well-known politicians, specifically Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden in these debates, she went after them, and it helped elevate her in the polls, and in all likelihood is one of the reasons why she was elevated to the level of being in this position of a possible vice president, moving forward. And so if you're a Democratic supporter and you watch these debates and the tone goes down and it's more conciliatory, it's more empathetic, is that really what you're looking for? And it begs some questions. So if the Biden campaign is interested in boosting motivation, drive, and interest to get people out and vote, not by November, not on November 3rd, but before November 3rd. So if you live in Indiana, if you're fellow Hoosiers, like myself, you should know that the polls are currently open, that early voting sites around the entire state are now, open. I voted yesterday and was number 247 by 11 o'clock, with the polls opening at 8 o'clock. I drove by the Bloomington early voting site today, and it was still wrapping around the block there. And so voter enthusiasm absolutely matters. And so is the Biden campaign at the point where they're kind of done persuading people to their side because Trump is well known, Joe Biden is well known? There's a very small percentage of the American population that are truly undecided voters. Most people likely know where they're going to land. They tune into these debates to get motivated, maybe a little bit more informed, but excited about their candidate. So that could mean that Kamala Harris goes in the opposite direction of that kind of conciliatory tone, or the empathetic tone towards the Trump administration, and rather in her position as advocate for Biden, she is then going to be a major just attack assistant in these debates. So with that said, one of the interesting things about presidential debates is they didn't really exist for the longest time. American politics thought it was very weird up until the turn of the 19th century for presidents to actually go out and campaign for themselves. Most of the time, presidents would just sit at home in their residence or at their place of employment if they're a lawyer or anything else, and they would never campaign for themselves. It would be embarrassing if a president would self-promote. That's just something that Americans didn't do up until the turn of the 19th century, and then the advent of radio and telecommunications. Once you can have that fireside chat where you can tune in directly into people's television within their homes, that was when the culture of America changed, and then presidents were able to directly speak to the American population. Pre that telecommunication, pre-mass communication, what happened is that you had surrogates that would navigate through the American states and would advocate for you. Well, that is now the role of the vice president within these debates, that their record doesn't necessarily matter, as much, generally speaking. It's more of how you can defend Biden, in that instance, or Vice President Pence defend Trump and their record, rather than keeping the limelight or attention on the vice presidential candidate. But as I mentioned, this debate is different. We have older presidential candidates. At any time, we know that, unfortunately, things can happen to bodies. And with that, is the American public going to demand more from the vice presidential candidates considering this debate? So let's go over to the vice presidential, the vice president, Mike Pence, and what is he looking to do within this debate round? So it's pretty clear that one of the core strategies that Trump had going into his debate performance was to try to separate the moderate and the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And so the interest was in showing that Biden is too moderate at times, and thus, because maybe he did not back Medicare for all, that the progressive wing of the Democrats will not show up at the polls. They won't be motivated to vote. Okay. But at the same time, the reverse strategy that also exists is to show that Biden is also too progressive, that he actually is going to be, tipped over by the radicals in the Democratic Party. And if that is the case, it motivates and drives the interest of the conservatives and the core base of Trump to get out and vote, right? Well, those are two contradictory messages, but American politics being what it was, and how we as humans tend to understand the world around us, we often accept contradictions due to basic biases and cognitive dissonance and things like that. And so it wouldn't surprise me if that line of attack continues tonight. The second thing that is somewhat interesting, though, is Kamala Harris would, while somewhat of a centrist, would also be further left, generally speaking, in reference to how people perceive her going into this debate round. And so, is he going to attack the record of Kamala Harris as being too progressive, either in DC, or as being too weak as an attorney general out in California, or anything else? How is she going to approach that? Because one fascinating thing about what's happening with this particular election is it seems like Trump and Pence are still running as essentially outsiders. Okay, with Trump being the spear of, or the head of the spear, when it comes to this issue, that he's still an outsider, that he's not a politician, and thus he is not responsible for government failures, whether it's COVID issues or economic issues or you name it. Okay. And so a lot of their lines of arguments are then directed at Biden being in DC as a career politician for 47 years. Are they able to tack that on to Biden and make him responsible for the issues that have happened around COVID or economic issues or anything else? Well, the fascinating thing about that is Pence has been in DC and American politics longer than Kamala Harris has. Kamala Harris is 55. She's younger. She did have some stints, or a stint as a senator, the attorney general back in California. But she's both younger and, I suppose you can say, less experienced than what Pence has had over his lifetime. Okay. And so how that line of attack is then dealt with by Harris, I think, in this vice presidential debate is going to be fascinating, and absolutely something that the debate prep teams likely spent a lot of time preparing for on the Harris side of things. Okay. I'm going to hop over real quick to our chat and see if there are any questions that maybe are starting to populate.